Welcome everybody, Joel Silverman here again. I can't tell you how excited I am for today's interview to have Greg Gianforte here with us. Greg, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Boy, I have so many questions written down to get this one started, Greg, but I'm gonna get off script what I normally start with, and let's go right to where the heck did your gene for entrepreneurship come from? Was it something early on in life? How did your parents foster it? And now I'm asking multiple questions, but it's amazing to get to sit down with somebody like you. So where did this start from?
Well, I love the challenge of a startup. I'm an electrical engineer, and maybe that means I like to solve hard problems. And I think some of the most complex problems in life usually involve people and marketplaces. And I started in junior high, mowing lawns, if you want to know the original motivation, it was because I wanted a dirt bike, bad. And I had to figure out how to get enough money because my parents said I could have it. They thought I was just going to go away. But they said, you have to go get the money yourself. So they said, this junior high school student won't find it. Well, I went and mowed all the lawns in the neighborhood for 2 summers to save up the money, and I got the dirt bike. And then that was really the spark that got it started.
And how old were you when you started that mowing business?
Junior high, but early teens.
Yeah. And from that, what did that then spark as your next business?
This was in the early mid 70s, and personal computers were just coming on the scene. In fact, the only one available, you had to get at Radio Shack. It was called a TRS-80, and a buddy of mine at school got one, and it was complex, and that complexity appealed to me.
Yeah.
So I got one, and then we ended up hanging around the Radio Shack store, and these business people would come in, and they were buying them too, but they didn't know how to use them. So we started writing software for these business people on the TRS-80.
Oh, wow.
Actually, the scary part, my first software program that I wrote for a paycheck, actually went into a shock and trauma ward at the local hospital. And I can't imagine doing this today just because of the liability involved. But when they brought the shock and trauma patients in, they took vital signals, they typed it into the program I wrote, and it calculated how much electrical shock to give them.
Wow.
I'm glad they're not using that software anymore.
That sounds like a lot of liability risk in that kind of program these days. So this was all happening back east, correct?
It was, in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. Yeah, I grew up just near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania.
What then brings you to Montana?
Well, I had a junior high school science teacher. This was going on at the same time, Tim Frabel, and he fought in World War II and flew P-51s in the Pacific Theater, but he trained at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls. So Montana was one of his great loves, but on a public school teacher's salary, the only way he could afford to get here every summer was to bring 2 van loads of 9th graders with him. So in 1976, we drove from Valley Forge to Red Lodge and spent the entire summer up in the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. And it's interesting, never underestimate the impact a teacher can have on a student. My mother was a public school math teacher, and Tim, because of his influence, 4 people on that trip in 1976 moved to Montana.
No kidding.
Yeah, and I was one of them. It took me a little while. I got here in '94, but the bug was planted, and I knew I wanted to make my life here.
And besides all the great outdoor things, what else about Montana brought you here? I mean, was there a business opportunity?
Well, I had started a number of businesses back east and had kicked off my career there. Gotten married. 3 of our 4 children were born, and it was the outdoors definitely, the public lands, the hunting, the fishing, but it was also the work ethic and the quality of the people. I would say that on the East Coast, people try and accumulate a lot of stuff, and they attach their sense of self-worth to it. And one of the wonderful things about Montana in my mind is that it is people are respected or disrespected based on the quality of their character and nothing else.
And so when you moved to Montana, did you have an active business going, or were you in between phases?
I had a little business, but it wasn't supporting us. I ended up, once we got out here, I actually sold it to a firm in Chicago. But we had this idea that the internet potentially could remove geography as a constraint. And you could literally build a global technology business in any location. And given we wanted to live in Montana, it seemed like a good thesis to put to the test. So we came here thinking we were going to do exactly that. And in the end, we started in an extra bedroom of our home with just $5,000, and that business grew to 1,100 people with an average Montana wage of almost $90,000 a year. We became the largest commercial employer in Bozeman and one of the largest ones in the state over a 15-year period. So we found that with good leadership and this incredible Montana work ethic, you can really compete globally. And the interesting thing, Joel, is that we didn't have any customers in Montana. You know, all of our customers were elsewhere. And but we got our inspiration from the great outdoors and the work ethic from the ranches here in Montana.
So I always find that entrepreneurs have a different level of drive, and it varies on where their drive comes from, because we all have our individual stories. Where does your drive come from as an entrepreneur? Because I'll also throw this at you. It's very rare to see that in an engineer.
You know what you know how you tell an extroverted engineer from an introverted engineer?
No.
The extroverted engineer looks at your shoes when he's talking to you. So there are stereotypes that apply, but I love solving problems. And you know, I have this thing, I love people, and I love being out, and the intersection of that, the creation process and technology and people ends up making you a serial entrepreneur. And I think you had mentioned this in our kind of our discussion ahead of time. I mean, it's not easy. It's not complicated, but it's not easy.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of business owners that are watching today. Only you know how hard it is.
Yeah.
Because to make payroll, to figure out where that next check's coming from, maybe the check's coming, is it going to show up on time? You know, all these things that just keep you up at night because you just don't know. I just think there's a lot of satisfaction in working on very hard problems.
And you mentioned the staying up late at night, or the worries that keep you up at night. What were some of your biggest worries, and how did you handle them? Internally, how'd you handle them?
Yeah, so that's probably, I used to be, in the early days, I used to be very, very frustrated because there's very little you can control. You can't control what a customer does. You can't control what the market's going to do. You can't control whether or not your key employee's son is going to get sick or not, or who, you know, whatever. And that was a real breakthrough moment for me in a prior business I had started when I realized that every person, you know, goes through regular personal catastrophes, whether the cat's sick, car broke down, whatever it happens to be, marital problems. And part of my job as a leader is to allow them to have the space they need to have a life and to work at the same time. And when I realized that I'm really not in control of anything, all I can control is my own attitude and the work I do each day. And it's not even the outcome, it's just the effort. And that's honestly helped me back in Washington too, because there's a lot of shenanigans and political theater and everything else. But I just focus on what I can do. And it's amazing how much progress you can make if you just keep running the 3 to 5 yard plays over and over again. The ball ends up in the end zone.
Yeah. That's, I can't remember if it was Bryant who said, if we run the play perfectly, we can run it every time and they still won't be able to stop us. Right? So it's that practice makes permanent. It's not always perfect, but...
We used to say that a different way. We used to say anything worth doing is worth doing over and over again.
Yes.
Because you get better and better at it.
Yeah.
And there is scale in repetition. and being able to figure out what is the tactic that works, and then building a strategy around it. That's a concept I took from Trout and Reese, who have written quite a bit about marketing. They wrote a book, it's now out of print, but it's one of the best books on marketing, called Bottom Up Marketing. And you don't even have to get it, because I could summarize the whole book in one sentence. It's find a tactic that works and build a strategy around it. And that takes me to where we started with our business right now, Technologies, and how we got started. We were solving a very simple problem, which was the internet was disrupting the way major consumer businesses were supporting their customers. It had been that if you wanted customer service from a consumer electronics company or the federal government, you called them on the phone. That was pre-internet. And then the marketing department put up a website and said, if you have a problem, send us your question. And the hurdle of effort required to send an email through a website was much lower than picking up the phone and calling. So what happened inside these corporations was the call volume, the number of requests for information, just went through the roof. And that was a problem that just begged for automation. And so that was the problem we set out to solve. And the first product, I kind of zeroed in on it. The first thing I did was I called 400 people that were in the customer service business in the technology industry, because they tend to adopt new technologies earlier. And I just asked them, how is the internet impacting the way you take care of your customers? And they all said the same thing. It says, these emails, we didn't get emails before, and no one's given me budget to answer them. And then they lower their voice and they'd say, so I'm just deleting them. Which, deleting customer emails, if anybody sent a company an email in the late 90s, they know you never got a response from a corporation. It's because of this problem. So we built some automation software that went into the website that made it easy for consumers to get immediate answers to their questions. And we used artificial intelligence and machine learning that we developed over time, and we really carved out a corner in the marketplace. And ultimately, it became one of the top 100 websites in the world. We had 8 million consumers a day coming. It was all of American Express, Sony, Motorola, 2,000 organizations all over the world. And we did it right here from Bozeman, Montana. And that first product didn't do all that stuff, because it was something I had hacked together in 6 weeks, and we put it up on the web and started charging $250 a month. And what that allowed us to do is get the wheels on the bus starting to turn. And they told us what they liked and what they didn't like, and we added new features. And that ultimately, that same product evolved over 15 years to the point where customers, large corporations, were regularly paying us millions of dollars for that same product.
How did you take Right Now from its inception in your garage, in essence, to scaling it so quickly? Because I find that even in my world, which we're still really small, we only have 16 team members, for us to scale to that level in a very short period, incredibly challenging. I can't imagine going to the scale of hundreds to then over 1,000 employees around the world.
Yeah.
How do you do that effectively?
Well, just to put it in perspective, we doubled the number of employees every 90 days for 3 years.
Wow.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
And so the only way you can do that is if you have good cash flow. So we actually, as many businesses go out of business from too much business as not enough business. And you know that. You have to build organizational capacity as you sell more jobs. But if you can't service the clients, they leave, and then they tell everybody else they got lousy service. Right?
Yes.
So that's a problem. So the key thing in a technology business is the cash flow. So we did something very, very unique in the way we structured our contracts early on to accelerate cash collection. Because, and there's a chapter on this in my book related to cash management. I took a class one time at a university, and it was an entrepreneurial class. And the first thing the professor said at the beginning, he says, if you remember one thing from this class, and only one thing, remember this: cash is more important than your mother. And we all wrote it down because we knew it was going to be on the test. Yeah. And it's true. You have to have cash. So the challenge early on is, how do you accelerate cash collection and defer cash expenditures? That goes back to this: you need more comes intas than goes outas.
Yes.
And if you do that, you'll have a business.
Yeah. So how? God, you were stirring so many questions inside of me. How did you accelerate the cash in versus the cash out?
So what we did two things to really accelerate the growth of the business. One was in our go-to-market, and the other was in our contract structures. Most software, enterprise software, that is software sold to large corporations back then, was sold under something called a perpetual license, where you paid up front for eternity. And customers didn't like it because they had these huge bills. But everybody that was getting into the cloud application business, which is, our business was one of the first cloud businesses, charged on a per month basis. Well, the problem with a per month basis contract is if you got $250 a month, you don't have the money to pay the commissions to the salespeople, you can't keep the lights on. So we created a hybrid contract up front where we would license the software to the client on a 2-year agreement. And it turns out that the cost of capital for our clients was much lower than our cost of capital as a startup. So sure, you want to pay monthly, we're happy to do that. But we were willing to give discounts to get acceleration of the payment. And that helped us cash flow the business. So that was the go-to-market aspect of it. And that was really an innovation in the space. Now this is pretty standard practice, but we really introduced it to the technology industry. The second thing was, and I talked earlier about good strategies are based around tactics that work. The other thing that was wrong with the way enterprise software was sold is it was primarily done through PowerPoint presentations. So a customer would get their requirements together, they'd write a big request for proposal, they'd ship it out, and these slick-suited sales guys and gals would show up with a PowerPoint, and they try and woo them and try and extract a large amount of money, and the customer never knew it was going to work or not. So there was huge risk for the customer. So, but this cloud delivery method where the technology actually exists in the cloud gave us an opportunity to totally change the selling process. So other clients, other vendors selling in this space use the traditional models, the slick suits, the PowerPoint presentations, and high risk for the customer. What we did, if you were a potential client of mine, I'd say, Joel, we can reduce the number of emails that your people have to answer by 50 to 70% by Thursday. And I have so much confidence in my product that I'll install it for you free of charge. Why don't you just try it for a little while? So it was like as someone says, it's like the puppy dog sale. You just let them take the puppy dog home with them.
Yes.
They find out they fall in love, and then they don't want to turn it off. So we called these pilots, and it became an integral part of our selling method. When you have confidence in your product, and you know it'll have a certain impact, and you know there's a clear pain point for the client, why not let them try it? Now, if we were selling automobiles, we wouldn't be able to do it because the cost of capital would have been too high. But in software, our cost of goods is almost zero. We had excess capacity in the data center. It was actually cheaper to implement our product for the client than it was to mail them a brochure. So why not just take the order?
Yeah.
And that's what we did.
Yeah.
So our salespeople would call up finding people that had this issue and offer a pilot. And over time, we moved to where we had them pay something for the pilot because we found out that they weren't as serious if they didn't have some skin in the game. But it was the money, we were charging the money more to make them serious than it was because we needed the money. Because we knew if we got the thing live, it wasn't going to get turned off.
Yes. I love that because two things for our audience, if you didn't pick up what he just threw down, which is amazing stuff. One, you went out and found the problem that these businesses were facing.
Yeah.
Number two, you then looked introspectively and said, what is the hurdle we're creating from the client that keeps them from buying us? You solved that hurdle, and then you went even a step further to say, but now we've created an additional pain point after giving it to them for free in that we were getting too many people who were just tire kickers, so we wanted to get people that were serious, so we then added a little cost on the front end to stop the tire kickers.
Right.
Brilliant. I love it. we've been going through that same kind of story in our world. So to me, this is fantastic stuff. I love it. This is great. I'd love to get into, if we can, stepping back in time a little bit. Susan, your wife, she was working side by side with you in Right Now Technologies and even some of your earlier businesses, right? How was that from a marriage standpoint? Because I'm a big believer. I go home, my wife is my sounding board. My wife talks to me a lot about my business. She may not know the numbers, but to me, it's invaluable to have
Susan
my wife.
does know the numbers. So,
Yes.
so we're both engineers. She's a mechanical engineer. We actually met at Bell Laboratories. Kind of funny story. We've been married 31 years. We met at the donut table after giving blood. So it wasn't very romantic, but it's worked out. So we've raised our 4 kids together. She's been my business partner. She's my hunting partner. She's my life partner. So we do everything together. And it's not without some friction, but you have to be ready to say, honey, I'm not willing to talk about that right now. You know, and the biggest challenge, I think, when spouses are brought in as sounding boards, you or I come home, we unload the dump truck of all the issues that occurred that day or that week, and your spouse picks them up, and you're unburdened, and now they're carrying this big burden. So I think one of the things you have to be careful of as an entrepreneur is, you know, kind of dumping and running. And so, because as the entrepreneur, you can actually do something about it. All your spouse can do is worry about it. So it's important to not put them in untenable situations. So I'm completely transparent with Susan, but I don't share every problem the minute it comes into my radar.
That's interesting. I've yet to have anybody talk about it that way. So when you would work with Susan on business aspects, because she was your financial side, she was in essence your CFO, right? Yeah. How did you guys create a separation from it? Was even from her standpoint, for her to even say, hey, no, we're at home, we're with the kids, time out, business behind.
Yeah.
Right? How did you guys work that out?
Well, I had a couple of, having started 5 businesses, we've raised 4 kids, and I couldn't be more proud of them. They were all up on their feet, and they're young adults and doing well. And when our last one, Rachel, went off to college, we dropped her off at the Bozeman airport. She was born here in Bozeman. Susan and I looked at each other, and we said, you know, we couldn't have fit anything else in. And it was a very satisfying feeling to know that all the camping trips and the fishing trips and the whitewater rafting trips, and it was just awesome. So I created some boundaries because a business can be all-consuming. So for example, if I was in town, I was always home for dinner at 6 o'clock, almost without exception. Now I might go into work at 5 a.m., but I was home and we had family dinner together. The second thing I did, which I would highly recommend, instead of taking a 2-week vacation, I took Fridays off in July and August. And it gave us 8 consecutive 3-day weekends when the kids were home from school. And almost every Friday morning we'd head to a trailhead and we'd put our backpacks on and we'd hike up to some alpine lake, and it would just be family time with no cell phones or anything else, just enjoying each other in the outdoors. And I think that instilled a strong sense of independence in them and a deep family ties. We just had them all home for Christmas. And we had game night one night, and somebody brought out a photo album of when the kids were little. And it was just neat to see them reminiscing about how much fun they had. And there was one instance where our black lab we turned it into a sleigh dog, and it had been pulling a sleigh with our daughter on it. And everyone remembered just, laughing till their bellies hurt when that was going on. But we were able to relive that. The other thing is I tended not to work weekends. I might get up Saturday morning and read some emails, but I kept Saturday and Sunday kind of separate. Now I had to travel a lot, so I wasn't always here for dinner, but when I was in town, I was home at 6 o'clock.
how did you, well, first, I guess I'll ask it this way. When you first started setting your boundaries, did you experience a level of guilt because your team is in the office working on a Friday and you're taking Fridays off in the summer?
If I had to be there, I'd be there. But I think a lot of what an entrepreneur feels is an inflated sense of self-importance. And you just kind of got to get over it. I had a situation early in our marriage. Susan was pregnant with our first child, just pregnant. We hadn't told anybody. And we had a big adventuresome vacation plan. And I said, well, I told her I can get away for 1 week. She goes, this is a long trip. We're going for 3. I said, the wheels are going to be off when I come back. The thing is going to plow in. There's going to be nothing there. It'll be dust. I can't go for 3 weeks. She goes, okay, you pick. And she didn't quite, it wasn't an ultimatum, but it was clear like, okay, who do you love more, this business or me? And we went on the trip for 3 weeks. You know what happened when I got back? All the salespeople had made their quotas. All the deadlines had been met. And they really didn't need me there for those 3 weeks. And it was probably one of the best lessons I could have learned.
How long had that developed, right? Like, was this at Right Now Technologies?
No, it was a prior business. Okay. Again, this is 30 years ago because our oldest son, who she was pregnant with at the time, was still in the womb. And this was a trip we couldn't tell anybody because we were actually doing a very large bicycle trip. So her going pregnant it was like now or never. Yeah. And you just don't argue with a pregnant woman.
There's a great lesson in that one. So you mentioned self-importance. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what I said is inflated sense of self-importance.
Yes.
We work very hard on culture at Right Now Technologies. And one of the principles of the culture was that every job is just as important as every other job. And I think that really gave us a competitive advantage. It was one of about 8 or 10 behaviors. And whenever we hired a new employee anywhere in the world, we flew them to Bozeman for 2 weeks of onboarding. And one of the first classes they had was me talking to them about corporate culture and what we wanted it to be. What were the behaviors that we wanted? And honestly, some of them were aspirational. Not all of them existed. But if you want to be an effective leader, you've got to honor the people that dedicate their lives to striving towards the goal. And I used to tell a story about, I think a lot of people think about a hierarchy in jobs where certain jobs are more important than other jobs. And I've just never accepted that because, if you take, and I would say this to the new employees, that every job is as important to our success as every other job. Otherwise, nobody would be here. Even the janitor who comes in the evening and cleans the offices, right? If they didn't do their job and no one emptied the waste paper baskets, every office would fill up with litter and no one would be able to get the work done and we certainly wouldn't accomplish our goals. So the janitor's job is not to clean the building. It's to provide a productive work environment so that we can accomplish our corporate goals. And I think one of the things I talk about a lot, in fact, I did a TEDx video on this, is how to find satisfaction in work. And it really, the heart of that is the purpose of all work, in my view, is to serve other people. And when you can help individuals connect with how the work they do day in and day out, whether they're approving insurance forms or drafting documents or whatever, if you can connect it to the people, there's a lot more satisfaction. You get a lot more skip in your step. It's like carpenters don't pound nails. They build homes for people. Cooks don't mix ingredients together. They entertain and nourish people. And so if we talked about this a lot in helping as part of our corporate culture in what our mission was. And we had a corporate mission and then we had individual missions. There were a number of them. One, we were in the customer service business and geez, there's a lot of bad practices there in customer service and government and private sector. But we were champions of it. But we were also out to reform the ethics of the software industry. And the third mission, and different people connected with different aspects of the mission differently, was to create challenging and worthwhile livelihoods for people in Montana. And that's what I've been working on for the last number of decades.
God, it's fantastic. I'm a big believer in culture. It is something we focus on a lot. And we do a one-day where we take our entire team and do an off-site, just work on culture. And then we try and hold each other accountable to that throughout the year. And it's one of those things, it's like a relationship. You don't just do it one day a year, you have to constantly work on it.
Yeah, and we found that as our business grew, we ultimately got to 17 offices around the world. So how do you preserve culture across cultures, countries, office locations? So we had to be more specific about what the behaviors were. And there were things like we show up for meetings on time because that shows respect to the other people. We're passionate about our work and our families. So it gave people permission to go to the T-ball game, you know. And we then created periodic awards that reinforce certain aspects of the culture. And of these 8 or 12 behaviors, we had each department in the company each year pick one of the behaviors which they did not think was being exhibited at the right level within their department. And then they do exercises related to that. And every year, as part of a standard, as part of the standard performance review for every employee got to rate the company on how well we're doing adhering to our culture statement on a behavior by behavior basis.
Yeah.
You know, how well are we working as teams? How are we showing up for meetings on time? Are we balancing work and life?
It's amazing stuff because I just eat that up. I love it. So you've authored a book, Bootstrapping Your Business.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that and why writing that book was so important to you.
Well, it started with an Inc. magazine article entitled "Start with Nothing," and it had a picture of me on South 19th in an office chair by myself with a pad of paper, sitting in the middle of a cut wheat field. And it was the story of how we started Right Now Technologies with really no resources, and yet we're able to double every 90 days. And that got published in Inc. magazine. And even 5 years later, I was still getting emails from people saying, hey, I read the article, I need to know more. So ultimately, I wrote Bootstrapping Your Business, which is, I make it available to anybody in Montana that wants a copy free of charge. All they have to do is go to bozeman.com and request a copy. I'll mail it out. But it is the process that I've used that is so much different than what's taught in business schools. Because this bootstrapping method is one where you start with the customer and the need, and you start selling before you start building. I mentor a lot of entrepreneurs, and one of the saddest things I ever hear, and the geeky tech guys tend to be attracted to me because I was in the technology business, but one of the saddest things I ever hear is they'll call me up and they say, Greg, I'd love to get an hour of your time to have you mentor me, and I've been working on this product for 3 years and I'm getting ready to go to market. I need some advice. I said, well, you should have called me 3 years ago. You know, because that's when you need the input. Engineers have a tendency to go into closets and build things. And it doesn't always survive the engagement. And the more time you put into the prototype or the project, the more committed you are to it. You get emotionally involved, and it makes maneuverability very difficult. So the bootstrapping process is really about, number one, picking a client or a class of clients, engaging with them. Confucius said, you're never in a position to learn until you're totally confused. And I think that's true. You want to immerse yourself to the point of disorientation until the light bulb goes on. And then there's an aha moment when you know that there is this need, and that if you had a product or service, you could address that need. And that's the point where you go back and, well, honestly, at that point, you ask them for some money. And they'll say yes or no. But if they say no, it's an opportunity to say, why not? And they'll tell you why not. And if you can do that, say, well, I'll do that. Will you give me money? And I don't want to be too crass about it, but it's no more complicated than that. That's what I did. And this Inc. magazine article is a great example of the first sort of 6 months of the startup process right now. What did he actually do? And if somebody Googles start with nothing and my last name, Gianforte, that Inc. article still comes up. And it's about 5,000 words. And it's kind of it's an interesting introduction. And if that kind of strikes a chord with you, I just invite anybody in Montana, go to Bozeman.com, request a copy of the book. I'll send it to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. You've got clearly a very deep drive to give back, right? You've mentioned it multiple times through this interview of ways in which you've been giving back. Where does that come from?
A big part of it is from my faith, because I believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. But it started when I was 32. I had this first business. We had been successful. We had started this company. It got acquired by McAfee, the antivirus company. I ran the McAfee business for a period. And then at 32, I moved to Montana, and we had 3 little kids. And I honestly, I didn't want to end up as a poor role model for my kids. So I think each one of us has been gifted with certain skills, and it's our stewardship responsibility to use those in such a way, as I said, to serve other people. And in software, we did that by making companies more competitive and taking better care of their clients. And in the process, we created a lot of high-wage jobs in Montana, and that was all good. And then I got pulled into public service because if not me, then who? And I still have a few at-bats left. So this has been an honor to serve Montana in the role I'm in currently.
There have been quite a few spin-offs that have been created from Right Now.
Yeah.
Right? People who've worked for you. I think somebody once told me
it's fantastic.
like 16.
Yeah, that's right.
In Bozeman alone.
It's that or double.
Yeah.
There's been quite a few. And this is a neat new cylinder on the economic engine for Montana. It's not going to replace agriculture or tourism, but it does create high-wage jobs. And there's now almost 400 high-tech firms in the state. Last year, high-tech in Montana exceeded $2 billion in revenue, which is significant. And I'm proud that our fingerprints are on it. I can't claim credit for all of it, but we showed that you can start a global technology business in a rural place and where you want to raise your kids. And there's an awful lot of communities in Montana that need a few more high-wage jobs, so we don't keep exporting our kids along with beef and grain.
And bring that around to your book. Was your book really another avenue to give back?
Sure. Yeah, I love mentoring entrepreneurs because, as we talked about before, I think the ultimately wealth is not created by government. It's created in the private sector by entrepreneurs who are willing to have those sleepless nights and put capital at risk. And yet we don't have entrepreneurship is not presented as an option very often. I lecture in a lot of high schools around the state of Montana, and I'll often ask, how many of you ever have thought about starting your own business? And virtually no hands go up. This is why we've been so passionate about trying to get some entrepreneurship curriculum into the high schools across the state, because it's the entrepreneurs that start the businesses, it's the businesses that create the jobs that allow people to prosper, and that's a big part of what we're missing here in Montana.
Absolutely. I'm currently working on a book right now that Main Street isn't dead, and that you can take on companies like Amazon in small town Montana. And being a business lawyer here, I'm fortunate that I do get to help so many small businesses be successful.
Yeah.
And we take a spin on it that our world is not just about presenting them with their legal issues, it's about helping them be profitable. Because if we don't have a client who is successful, then they're not a lifetime client for us.
Yeah, if there's no profit, there's no oxygen in the room.
Yeah, got to keep the fire burning.
Right, exactly.
That is fantastic. Anything you'd like to leave as parting words, Greg, for our viewers?
Well, I would just say if you're thinking about starting a business, go for it. I would, and don't overcomplicate it. It's about finding a customer and creating value and doing that over and over again until you're able to sustain yourself. And Winston Churchill said, which I love this quote, he said, "Successful people go from failure to failure with undiminished enthusiasm." It's really, really hard. There will be a lot of ups and a lot of downs, but there's a lot of satisfaction in the achievement too. So don't rob yourself of that opportunity.
Greg, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Everybody, want to let you know you can find us on YouTube, Instagram, all social media avenues, on our podcast as well, across all the avenues there. Want to give a big shout out to Social Flicks, my main man Brad Oldhouse behind the camera, who's also normally here asking questions. Greg, thank you. Susan, thank you. What a wonderful experience this was for us. I really can't tell you, how great this was. So thank you for your time. I know you've got a very busy docket these days. Again, to thank Social Flicks, thank Silverman Law Office, who sponsors this and helps us put this on. Again, I'm Joel Silverman here for the Montana Business Vlog. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.